microphone and hand over to her. Enjoy the webinar, and I'll see you again at.
Yep, I'm here. Hopefully you can all see and hear me. Perhaps you could just give me a little sign in the chat box that everything's going okay. Oh, lots of people typing. So, yep, I'm getting lots of yeses. Lovely. That's a great start. Good. So, good afternoon from a lovely sunny Bristol. And thank you very much all for tuning in from such an amazing variety of different places. I'm guessing for some of you it's going to be early morning, some of you it's going to be evening. So thanks very much for your time. As Sean said, my main interest is in vocabulary. I love words. And today I'm going to be talking particularly about teaching vocabulary at higher levels. Now, by this, I mean kind of post-intermediate, so upper intermediate and advanced students. So in CEFR terms, probably B2 plus is what I'm going to be talking about today. And I'm going to be talking particularly about some of the specific challenges we have in teaching vocabulary to this group of learners, and some of the slightly more difficult choices we have to make about what to teach to this group. So let's get started with a few questions, things that I hope to answer over the next 45 minutes or so. So I'm going to start off by looking at the question of why teaching English at higher levels is different from teaching English vocabulary to beginners. I think that there's quite a big difference between teaching vocabulary at beginner level, at intermediate and advanced. So we'll have a look into that. I will also look at particularly how we can choose which words we want to focus on, because I think this is one of the biggest challenges when we're looking at advanced learners. And then I'll go on to look at a number of different things that we need to consider when we're planning activities for our more advanced classes. So I'll be speaking hopefully for around 45 minutes, and I'll try and leave a little bit of time at the end for questions. As Sean said, I may spot your questions in the chat box as we go along, and if so, I'll try to answer them. But there's a lot of activity, so I might not spot them, but Sean will be picking up questions for me to answer at the end. Okay, so how is teaching advanced vocabulary different to teaching lower levels? So if we take a step back and if we look at the pre-intermediate stages of learning, as students are starting to learn English, they're mainly developing a core vocabulary. So the most common useful words in the language that we need to explain basic concepts. And we can see those as illustrated by something like the Oxford 3000 word list. That's a list of the 3,000 most frequent words in the language, which most students will need to acquire in order to carry out basic interactions in English. And we would expect students to have mastered most of these words up to about B1, B2 level. And at this point, students they're desperate for vocabulary. They need words in order to communicate, in order to fill semantic gaps. So for example, if a student says, what's this? I can tell them it's a pen, and they've filled that gap. They now have a word to describe that object. And that continues on up into intermediate level. But then they reach a point that sometimes described as the intermediate plateau. So they reach a level where they kind of stop. And this isn't just with vocabulary, this happens with lots of different aspects of language. When students reach intermediate level, their progress seems to kind of slow down. And from a vocabulary perspective, this is often because they have enough basic vocabulary to get by. They can communicate most basic ideas. So their motivation for learning new vocabulary kind of decreases. Now, that's not to say that they're not learning new words, but they tend to be learning words for receptive use. So that means they come across new words that they check the meaning of, and they understand them when they see them again, when they read them or when they hear them, but they don't necessarily start to use them productively. So they don't use those words in their own writing and speaking because they don't need to, because they can rely on this kind of comfortable, basic core vocabulary that they're familiar with, and they just keep using the same words and expressions rather than pushing and taking risks with the new vocabulary. So we start to see a gap opening up between the receptive vocabulary, the words they recognize, and their productive vocabulary, the words they're actually using themselves. And this is a challenge. Once we are moving on to the more advanced levels, we're trying to push students to develop not just their range of vocabulary, so not just the number of words they know, but their depth of vocabulary. And this is what they really need in order to increase their productive vocabulary, to make their own language more rich. They need to understand usage. They need to understand how to use the words that they're learning. And they also need to become more autonomous learners. There are something like 250,000 words in English, and the average L1 English speaker might know something like 20 to 30,000 words. And there's no way we can teach that amount of vocabulary in our classes. So it's important that we help our students to acquire the skills they need to acquire vocabulary outside the classroom, as well as just the words we teach them. So how do we go about doing this? How do we go about teaching advanced learners? Well, I have to admit that when I started teaching, my approach to vocabulary at higher levels was a bit of a scattergun approach. I got quite excited because I was no longer restricted to the vocabulary I could use with the lower level students. Now I had this free range of all this wonderful vocabulary that I could use with my higher level classes. And I would choose a text, often an authentic text, which I thought would be interesting to my students. And I'd pick out lots of words and phrases to highlight. But it wasn't necessarily the most effective approach, just throwing lots of words at the students and hoping that they would stick somehow. And I realized that we need to be a little bit more principled. We need to have a rationale for which words we choose to teach, to focus on, and how we go about teaching. So I think the first question we need to ask ourselves as teachers when we're approaching vocabulary, or anything to be that honest, is why am I teaching this? What's my rationale? What's my reason for focusing on this in class? And when we're looking at vocabulary, I think there's two important questions that we need to ask. Is it receptive vocabulary? Is this vocabulary that we think will be useful for our students to recognize? Words they might come across when they're reading or listening to things or watching films or TV. Or is it productive vocabulary? Is it words and expressions that we think our student will be useful for our students to use for themselves in their own speaking and writing? Yeah. Now that's not always a clear-cut distinction. Yeah, we can't always predict what's going to be useful for our students to use productively, but we have a pretty good idea of what our aims are here. And if we're looking at vocabulary that's mostly for receptive use, then we need to focus on comprehension. Yes, focus on the meaning of the vocabulary. We don't necessarily then need to follow that up with exercises that practice production. We don't necessarily need to get our students to use those words in sentences if we don't think they're going to be useful for them to use. Yeah. If we're looking at productive vocabulary, on the other hand, if we're looking at language that we hope our students will start to use, then the focus for activities should be on usage, on how do I actually use these words for myself. And as I've mentioned before, this is one of the areas that's particularly problematic for higher level students. Often their receptive vocabulary increases as they read lots of different texts, they acquire new words that they recognize, but often their productive vocabulary kind of gets stuck. And as teachers, we need to shift that a little bit. Let's have a look at an example of what I mean by that. So I'd like to have a look at an example of a little bit of research here that was carried out by an American researcher, Hinkle, in which she took two groups of students. They were all undergraduate students at an American university, but one group were local American students whose first language was English. The others were international students who had come to study at the university for whom English was a second language. So they were learners of English. They were high-level learners because they'd been accepted to study at this American university, but nonetheless they were learners. And she gave both groups the same task. She asked them to write an essay, a straightforward essay, on the topic of education. Same question for both groups. And then she had a look at the language that they produced, and she noted down the features that were specific to the learners. And what she found was this. She found that the learners particularly used the verb be as a main verb. So they used it particularly in sentences where we had a subject, be, and then an adjective. So the weather was hot. The lesson was difficult. Yeah. This was an incredibly common pattern because it's an easy pattern for learners. It's one of the first patterns that they learn, and it's one that they fall back on quite frequently. They also use quite a lot of vague nouns, so words like people and things, rather than more specific words. So they would talk about people instead of individuals or consumers or employees, those more specific vocabulary words. And they also used quite a lot of what I've described as personal language. So words describing how they feel. So internal processes, think, want, feel, and basic interpersonal communications, say and tell. And of course, this is really important in everyday conversation. We use a lot of these words a lot when we're interacting with people. But students, when they're progressing past that and they're starting to write maybe about more grown-up, more abstract topics, this language is not quite so appropriate anymore. So let's have a look at examples. What you can see here is two examples from this study. So they're both examples of writing on kind of similar topics. On the left side, you have what the learner produced, and on the right side, you have what the L1 English speaker produced. Give just a moment to have a look at those and see what features you notice in the language here. And I wonder if anybody there can spot any errors in the learner example. Is there anything in that example that you think is actually incorrect and that you would correct if you were marking it? Not just style, but actually incorrect language. Feel free to type your suggestions in the chat box if you spot anything. Have interest in, yeah, maybe marginal. Take an interest, yeah, that's possible. Be interested in, yeah, maybe. Yes, well done, Laura. I would say that the only real thing that you could say is a direct error in this piece of writing is this word unattentive. It should be inattentive. But otherwise, it's kind of correct, but it's just very awkward. Yeah, there's a lot of repetition. It's not written in a very good style. If you notice, the title of Hinkle's paper is Simplicity Without Elegance. And I think that sums up the problem here very clearly. If you have a look at the language in the learner, they have lots of examples of this verb be. People are sleepy, people are inattentive, learning is hard, the lesson is enjoyable. So lots of repetition of the verb be. We have the vague nouns, we have people again. We have an example of this personal language. So people think, people have an interest in. So again, this is lots of personal language. And when we compare it to the L1 English speaker, their writing is much more concise for a start. They convey a lot more ideas in a short space. They use lexical verbs. So we have the verb increase and we have the phrasal verb bring out instead of just be. And they also have more interesting subjects, more complex, more abstract subjects and objects. So instead of it being about people and students, it's about topics, maturity, entertainment, creativity. Now, these aren't difficult words, and quite probably in this context at this level, the learner on the left would have no trouble understanding what the L1 English speaker on the right had written. Those words will probably be well within their receptive vocabulary, but they're just not confident enough to use that vocabulary for themselves. And this is an issue that we come across time and again, that students, they play safe. They go for the language that they're familiar and comfortable with, rather than pushing themselves to use the slightly more sophisticated writing style, thank you Melinda, that they need to be trying to work towards. So what can we do about this? Well, I would like to suggest that one of the most important things that we need to do is, rather than pushing on with lots and lots of new vocabulary constantly, which is a temptation and which students want, they like to learn new words, I think sometimes we need to take a step back and we need to strengthen that core vocabulary in order to improve students' productive abilities. So I mentioned that core vocabulary would be kind of the top 3,000 most frequent words. Words that students know, but they're possibly not using to their full extent. Let's have a look at an example of what I mean. One of the things that students need to be able to do is to use vocabulary flexibly. So they need to be able to, rather than using words always in the same way, they need to be able to be a little bit more adaptable. And if we look at this example here. This is a dictionary entry for the verb increase. So very straightforward word. And if we have a look, we can see, if we look at the top of the entry here, the first example says the population has increased from 1.2 million to 1.8 million. And this is a very typical kind of usage of the verb increase. It's describing numbers and statistics, and it's used in an intransitive sense. So we're saying that something increases, the population increased. And this is the kind of way that a lot of students are likely to use this verb. I don't know if any of you teach IELTS, but if they are doing IELTS task 1, where they have to describe a graph, they'll all use this word a lot, but they'll use it in this way. If we look at the next couple of examples, we have something slightly different. We have increasing levels, increasing numbers. This time the verb is being used as a modifier, a bit like an adjective. That's another interesting usage. But the usages that I'm more interested in, if we go down a bit more to here, we have the example, disability increases with age. Now we're not talking about numbers anymore. We're talking about a slightly more abstract concept here. Yeah? So disability increases with age. And if we go down one more, again, we have an abstract concept, but this time we have a transitive use of the verb. So we need to increase productivity. So someone increases something. And this, if we quickly skip back to our examples, this was exactly what we had up here from our student. So serious topics can increase one's maturity. So we've got a transitive use of the verb, and we've got an abstract noun, maturity, here. So what can we do about this with our students? Well, what I have here is a graphic that illustrates some of the key collocations, the words that we use with the verb increase. And so it takes a little while to get your eye in here, but in the green section at the top, we have subjects of increase. So when increase is being used as an intransitive noun, and we have noun plus increase. So we can see population increases, numbers increase, costs increase. Yeah. And then at the bottom, in pink, we have examples of collocations with increase where the noun is the object of the verb. So in a transitive sentence. So we can increase demand, increase efficiency, increase awareness. And in the middle, we have some that can be used for both. So something like risk, you can say the risk increases, or you can say something increases the risk. And I would use this for my students to get them to try and write some example sentences of their own using these combinations. Now, how many combinations I give them would depend on the level of the students. So if I was going to use this particular graphic, I would only use it with a very high level class, an advanced class. If I had an upper intermediate class, I would probably simplify it. But what I'm encouraging the students to do is to play around with using this word that they think they know, but actually using it in slightly different ways. So you're encouraging them to experiment a little bit. Another example is thinking about words not just in their basic meanings, but thinking beyond that. In English, lots of words have multiple meanings, a concept known as polysemy. So if you look in a dictionary, you'll probably find a number of numbered senses for one word. Yeah? So the different meanings that the word is used in. But again, students tend to learn the first meaning or the first couple of meanings, but then they don't really go past that. So if we take another basic verb here. I'm focusing on verbs because I'm trying to get students away from just saying be constantly. So these kind of key verbs are a really good point to focus on. And we have the most common usage of this word. So his parents won't allow him to stay out late. He's not allowed to stay out late. This allowed to, not allowed to is probably the meaning of the word that most students will be familiar with and which most students will use. But if I scroll down the entry a little bit, I come to sense number 4, and this is a slightly different meaning. And it's about making something possible. So a ramp allows easy access for wheelchairs. Now again, if my students read this, they'll probably understand it. It's not that it's outside their knowledge altogether, but they're probably not using it in this sense. Yeah, they're probably not exploring beyond that basic meaning. So what I would do here is I'll give my students a set of vocabulary, a set of example sentences using this meaning of allow, to make something possible or enable them to do something. And I'll ask them to divide these sentences into 2 groups. And I'm going to ask you to do the same thing. There are 2 patterns of usage here. So the meanings are the same, but the grammatical patterns are slightly different. Can you spot the 2 different grammatical patterns happening here? Perhaps you could type some ideas in the chat box for me. What 2 patterns of usage are there here? Oh, a few people typing. See if anybody can spot them. Oh, okay, starting to pop up. Yep, yes, yep. Yes, lots of you are spotting it. You're way too good for this. Okay, so what's going on here is we have the 2 patterns that a lot of you are spotting. So we've got the first one is with a simple direct object, a noun object, so allow something. So it allows easy access, it allows hands-free use, it will allow the development of better training facilities. Now, this is a noun phrase, and that's something that you need to get students at this level used to, that an object isn't just necessarily a singular word, it can be a whole phrase. And then the other set, as so many of you have pointed out, is allow somebody to do something. So schools allow young people to walk to class, allow the user to search, allows customers to book appointments, has allowed many of us to work from home. Yeah. So what I've done here with the students is 2 things really. First of all, I got them to think about this meaning of the word allow. I've given them lots of examples, so they're really immersed in this sense of allowing something, meaning to enable it. But then haven't just stopped there. I didn't just stop at meaning. I've made them do a little bit more analysis. They've had to process the language a little bit more deeply in order to think about the grammatical patterns or the colligations. So this the grammatical patterns that go with a word. So we have the word allow, and the colligation, the grammatical pattern that goes with it, is somebody or to do something. So they've had to think about this vocabulary, and a lot of research shows that the more processing involved in a task, the more students will remember the language. So getting them to think beyond something superficial and to do something with the language is a really important part of learning. Okay, so both of these examples, we're getting students to think about fairly basic core vocabulary, but we're getting them to think about expanding not their range of vocabulary knowledge, but their depth of knowledge. And this is really important for these higher level students to have a deeper knowledge of words rather than just keep adding to a list somehow. And one of the key researchers in this area, Paul Nation, developed this table which looks at depth of vocabulary knowledge. Now, it's a little bit of a big table, but if we break it down, we can see that he's looking at 3 aspects of word knowledge. And he's looking at all the things that we might need to know about a word in order to be able to either recognize it or use it. So he looks at form, meaning, and use. And if we have a little look at the top here, he's looking at the spoken form. So the first one here is to do with reception. So what does the word sound like? In order to understand a word, you have to recognize it when you hear it. And then from the perspective of production, how is the word pronounced? If I want to use this word, how do I say it? Similarly, with writing, what does the word look like? When I see it on the page, how can I recognize it? And from the perspective of production, how is the word written and spelled? If I want to write it myself, how do I spell it? He looks at word parts, so thinking about the inflections, the endings we might have on a word, the prefixes and suffixes. So we saw before the example of unattentive, inattentive. So that prefix is a part of a word that we need to recognize or understand in order to use the word effectively. Then he looks at meaning. So you need to be able to link the form to the meaning. So what does this word form signal? So if I see the written form P-E-N, or hear the word pen, that's what it's referring to. It's referring to this object. Yeah. So I can link the word to the meaning. But it's not as simple as just the basic meaning. I also need to understand what is included in this concept. So what can the word pen refer to? Well, it can refer to that one. It can refer to that one. It could also refer to that one. Yeah, I don't know if you can see those clearly. They're all pens. Yeah. But if I go to this one, if you can see that, it's not a pen anymore. It's a pencil. So that's not part of the word. It's not included in the word pen. So we need to understand, what does this word encompass? What does it refer to? Also, what other words does it make us think of? We need to understand the associations between words. So what are synonyms? What are other words with a similar meaning? What are the antonyms? What are other words with different, opposite meanings? Yep, so somebody's come up with writing tool. Yeah, difficult to find a synonym for pen, to be honest, but we can come up with a hyponym or a superordinate. We can talk about stationery, and that includes pens and pencils and notebooks and all those things. So understanding the associations between words in the language is an important part of understanding meaning. Then we have the grammatical patterns that we've already just been looking at. So in what patterns does the word occur, and in what patterns must we use this word? If we want to use a word, we need to know what those patterns are. What about the collocations? What other words or types of words occur together with this word? So if I have a mistake, do I do a mistake or make a mistake? Well, we make a mistake. No particular reason. I just need to learn that pairing, those collocations. So all these things are part of understanding a piece of vocabulary, a word or an expression. But the final one here at the bottom, constraints on use, I think is particularly relevant to more advanced learners. So understanding when, where, and how often we can use a word, I think becomes more and more important as we go up the levels to more advanced learners. Let's have a look at an example why. So if I take a really simple word, so an A1 word, something you'd learn at beginner level, the word walk. Yep. It's a fairly neutral, boring kind of word. There's not much to say about it. It describes an action, We can use it in any kind of context. We can use it in speech and writing. It's not particularly positive or negative. And this is true of a lot of the basic vocabulary that students learn at lower levels. It's a little bit boring. It's quite neutral. So usage is not such an issue. These constraints on use, so we can use it anytime we like. But as students progress up the levels and they start to look at more variety, more interesting vocabulary, if you like, that changes. Let's have a look at some of these words here. We've got some lovely juicy vocabulary here. So we've got lots of words that all describe walking. But there's a lot more to understand about these words. So if we go for a word like wander, gentle, relaxed kind of walking. So it's a particular kind of walking. Hoof it, very informal expression, slightly slang expression almost, to describe somebody walking somewhere. Stalk. Now this is, if you like, it comes from the idea of an animal hunting, stalking its prey. But if we use it to talk about people, it has very negative connotations. If you stalk someone, you follow them in a threatening kind of way. It can actually be a criminal offence to stalk somebody. So very, very negative connotations with that word. Perambulate, fabulous word, but it's a very, very formal, very old-fashioned kind of word. It's not a word that I think I've ever used or would ever need to use. It's the sort of word you might come across in very old literature, Victorian literature perhaps. Traipse, negative again, but in a different way. If I've been traipsing around the shops all afternoon, I'm tired and my feet hurt, it's describing the feeling with which somebody is walking. Waddle, also negative, but in a kind of different way. If somebody waddles, they walk like a duck. And this is a kind of a comical word. You wouldn't use it to somebody, say you're waddling, that would be quite offensive, but you might use it in a story, perhaps a children's story, to conjure up this idea of how this person's walking. And what about march? This can be soldiers marching, or it can be a slightly more metaphorical, a person, he marched into my office and started to complain, somebody walking with purpose. So lots of different words here that on the surface all mean walk in some way, but lots of different things that we need to consider about these words. So we need to consider the connotations. Are they positive, negative, humorous, offensive? We need to consider the register. Are there very formal words or informal words? When is it appropriate to use them? Are they literary words? We need to consider the frequency. Now, this might seem a strange thing to say, but I've come across a lot of advanced learners who are reading very widely and taking in lots of vocabulary, and then they use a very unusual word in the middle of an ordinary sentence. And it sounds strange because it's an unusual low frequency word that I don't expect to come up in everyday conversation. And one of the problems is when we're looking, if I meet somebody whose level of English is quite low, then I tend to make allowances for them. So if somebody is very hesitant and their grammar is very basic, if they use a word that doesn't quite fit, I don't worry about it. I just try to understand their meaning. But if somebody whose level of language seems to be quite high, they're quite fluent, and they use an unusual word, I hesitate. Well, why did they use that word? What do they mean? Are they trying to be pompous? Are they trying to be unfriendly? So we make more judgments about advanced learners. So it's really important that they understand when it's appropriate to use words. Metaphor. Are we using words metaphorically? We saw an example of that before. Sociolect. Now, I hesitated over what to call this, But what I'm talking about here is the words that different groups of people typically use. So there's some vocabulary that's very typical of young people. There's some vocabulary that's more typical of older people. There are certain words that are more commonly used by men and some that are used by women. So there are words that I would recognize. So hoof it, for example, as a phrase, isn't part of my sociolect. It's not the kind of expression that I would use personally. And that's also important for students to think about. You don't want a teenager talking like a grandmother. It would sound strange. Yeah. Then obviously we need to think about things like collocation, which words are used together, colligation, these grammatical patterns that we've already seen, lexicogrammar. So what are the inherent grammatical characteristics of the word? So in this case, are these verbs regular or irregular? And also the morphology, the parts of the words. For example, can I add ER to the end of these words in order to describe a person? So we can have a walker, we can have a marcher. Can we have a waddler or a traipser? Probably not. We can definitely have a stalker. So understanding how the parts of words work and what's possible and what's not. And then also finally regional variation. So these are words that I've taken from British English. Would an American use these words? Would an Australian use these words? There might be differences. And again, that's something important for students to know. Now, lots of lovely words there and lots of fabulous terminology. I wouldn't throw all this at my students. I think that's really important to say. How much terminology I use would depend on the class. And I certainly wouldn't try to teach them all of these words all in one go, because they won't remember them. And remember at the beginning, we talked about receptive and productive vocabulary. I wonder how many of these words would you teach your students for production? Perhaps you could type in the chat box, which words here do you think, apart from walk, which is obvious, which words would you teach your students to use rather than just to recognize? Yeah, so we've got a few votes for wander and march, stalk maybe. Yeah, you've got a really good sense for this. Both wander and march are fairly high frequency. So they're not in that top 3,000 most frequent words, but they're both in the top 5,000. And that kind of mid-frequency vocabulary is useful for more advanced learners. Yeah, quite a few votes for stalk, probably. The others, perambulate, don't get your students to use that word. It will sound ridiculous. Yeah. So again, lots of ideas here, but think about a bit more carefully about how you teach it to your students. Now, for the last part of the webinar, I want to flip the idea of vocabulary learning the other way. So far, we've been starting with the words and then looking at the usage. And I think when we're teaching advanced learners, we can kind of flip it the other way. We don't always have to focus on the individual words. It's equally important to teach our students about vocabulary and about how it works in a more general sense. So let's have a look at an example. This is a text that I have taken from New Scientist magazine, which is a magazine about new scientific discoveries and ideas, but it's aimed at a general audience. And this particular text is about carbon emissions from aircraft. You don't need to read the whole text, but it's a short text that I might want to do with my students. And if I want to focus on the vocabulary here, there's a number of ways I can tackle it. So one that I might choose would be to look at the register. So the words that I've highlighted in red here are all fairly formal, fairly academic, fairly scientific words. So we've got So we've got contrails, the lines that are left behind aeroplanes. We've got carbon dioxide emitted. Emitted is a nice academic word. Accumulated in the atmosphere. Non-CO2, so scientific language. Associated emissions. And then in this last paragraph, we've got lots of kind of slightly formal scientific words. High altitudes, water vapor, condense, soot particles. Yeah. So that's not surprising. This text is about a scientific academic topic, so we'd expect that kind of register of vocabulary. But if we look a bit more closely, we'll see the words that I've highlighted in blue here are much more informal. They're much more spoken vocabulary. They're a little bit more dramatic. So we have the start of this sentence here, worse still. That's kind of, oh, it's dramatic. The figure will soar even higher. I'm really emphasizing it here. And why has the writer chosen the word soar here? Why did they not just say increase dramatically? Anyone want to suggest why the writer here has chosen this particular verb to describe the increase in emissions? Imagery, yeah. Emphasis, yeah. More specifically. Yes, it's kind of giving more emphasis, but what soars? What things soar? Anyone going to get it? It's more dramatic, it's more emphasis. Yeah. Yes, thank you, Anna. Yes, so birds soar and so do aeroplanes. Yeah, it gives this image of something going up into the sky. Yeah, it's creating a picture for the reader. And the reason for this, yes, it's metaphor. Thank you, Jane. The reason for this is because although this is about science, the text is actually written as a piece of journalism. It's for a wider audience and it's trying to attract the reader's attention. It's trying to make it more interesting, more accessible. So you get this mixture of the formal scientific vocabulary and the slightly more informal, kind of more spoken vocabulary. So lots of people all the time. At the end here we have this wonderful idiom that it's the elephant in the room. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but it's talking about, it's the thing that nobody's talking about. It's really important. So we're all sitting here having a discussion and there's an elephant in the corner of the room, but nobody's talking about the elephant. Yeah. So idioms are a very common part of journalism and this style of language. And I think it's really important that students recognize this when they're reading. Why has the writer made these vocabulary choices? Yeah, they don't just say, oh, this is a formal text, so it has formal language, and this is a creative text, so it has creative language. In reality, we see a mixture, and raising students' awareness of this, I think, is really important. One more look at what we could do with this text. So we could look at register, but we could use the same text to look at a completely different aspect of vocabulary. We could use it to look at lexicogrammar, at the grammatical features of the vocabulary. And the thing that I've picked on here are the nouns. There are fabulous nouns in this text. As soon as I saw it, I spotted these lovely nouns. So if you look, you'll notice that there's quite a mix of types of nouns. So I would highlight them and I would get my students to work out which ones are countable, which ones are singular, plural, uncountable. Yeah. And there's some quite interesting ones here. So at the beginning, we have this countable plural noun, aeroplanes. But then a bit later on, we have aircraft. Now this is an irregular plural. So aircraft is the singular and the plural form. We have quite a lot of nice uncountable nouns here as well. But what about this one? Fuels. Normally fuel is an uncountable noun. But here we're talking about different types of fuel. So it becomes countable. So lots and lots of ideas here for looking at the language, looking at a feature of the language. And what I might do after we've looked at this is to pick out a collection, maybe not all of those nouns, there's quite a lot there, but I would choose some of the nouns, cover the text, and ask students to write paraphrases of sentences of how was this noun used in the text, and getting them to think about what verb form do I need to go with this? Is it a singular, plural, uncountable? What's the agreement with the verb? So I'm raising their awareness of a particular feature of language. Yeah. So what I'm doing here is not teaching lists of words. I'm teaching students to be aware of some of the features of vocabulary that they might need to recognize when they're learning vocabulary for themselves outside of the classroom. I'm giving them a framework within which to see vocabulary. So when they come across it for themselves, they'll ask these kind of questions. Do I need to think about the connotations or the register? Do I need to think about how this word is used grammatically? Yeah. And in this way, I'm hopefully making them more autonomous learners. I'm not just feeding them lists of words. I'm giving them the skills they need to explore vocabulary for themselves. Okay, we're nearly out of time. So let me just wrap up for you. So I've thrown lots of things at you. Apologies. I hope I haven't overloaded you too much. But if there's a handful of things I'd like you to take away from today's webinar, they would be, when you're teaching vocabulary to these higher levels, make sure you have a clear rationale. Why are you choosing the vocabulary you are to focus on? What is the aim of your vocabulary activities? Think about whether the vocabulary you're focusing on is for receptive use or productive use. Think about strengthening that core vocabulary. Don't just rush ahead with lots of new words all the time, but go back and work on those words that are really important for students to use. Think about the depth of knowledge as well as just their range of knowledge. Remember that usage is really, really important with higher levels. Understanding when it's appropriate to use a word is absolutely vital for more advanced students. And finally, don't just teach lists of words. Try and teach your students about vocabulary. Help them to understand how English vocabulary works. And that's where I'm going to stop. I think we've probably just got a couple of minutes for questions. If anybody has any questions, if you'd like to pop them in the chat box. I think you've been quite quiet as we've gone along. I hope I haven't stunned you into silence. But anybody got any questions? No, lots of thanks. No questions. Oh, goodness. I have stunned you into silence, haven't I? Anything that anybody... Did you gap the nouns? I probably wouldn't do in this context because I'm not really focusing on the meaning of the nouns here. I'm looking at how they work in the sentences. So if going back to that text with the nouns in it, I wouldn't take them out because I'm not really focused on the individual words. I'm looking at how they're used. Colligation, yes, sorry. This is a concept that is a very simple concept, but I'm afraid I'm using a difficult term for it. So colligation is a little bit like collocation, but for grammar. So if we think about a particular word, so we had the word allow, the colligational patterns it forms, so its colligations are the grammatical patterns that can follow it. So is it transitive or intransitive? Can it be followed by just a direct object, or can it be followed by something allow somebody to do something? So these grammatical patterns that go with a word, that's the concept of colligation. Yeah. Oh, I've got another question here. Somebody has said, how many words should we teach each session? Oh, that's a big question. It depends on the students, and it depends what you mean by teach, and it depends on the kind of words. So if we're looking at completely new words that we think students won't have met before at all, then we need to probably limit it. I would say 8 words, maybe, perhaps 10. Because if you give students too much new vocabulary at the same time, they're simply not going to remember it. It depends a little bit on the actual vocabulary. So some words, concrete nouns, are much easier to remember than slightly more abstract words. If we're looking at productive vocabulary, though, where students already know the meaning and we're looking at usage, then the rules might be slightly different. So I would say there isn't a set number of words, but don't overload students with pages of words because they simply won't remember them. One more quick question. How did you make the graphs for nouns versus objects? I used a tool called Sketch Engine. Let me just pop that in the box for you, unless Sean beats me to it. Sketch Engine. It's a great tool. There's a free version which will allow you to do some things. I use a paid for version which gives me more facilities, but something to go and have a look at and play with if you want. Any other questions? Let's have a look. Could you suggest some useful texts to read for advanced students? Julie. Well, I think that completely... I think
we got through most of the questions. I knew a few more came at the end, but unfortunately time is time. So thank you, Julie, for a very informative session. Let's switch off your camera and stuff now. And just to remind people, as we